All right, this is John Benson from the State EOC. John Paoli, it's 1 o'clock. I assume we're good to go. If I don't hear anything different, we're just going to get going.
Perfect.
As I said, my name is John Benson. I'm the Chief of Staff with the Iowa Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I am joined by Lucinda Parker this afternoon, who is our Strategic Communications Lead for the Department. And we wanted to have a discussion about how media and open records requests kind of interface, and kind of walk through some of that, because we've had, with the COVID this year, kind of some unique experiences with how open records and media interfaces, and the challenges that presents, but it also presents some unique opportunities to succeed. So we kind of wanted to buzz through that and maybe give you guys some tips on things that you might be able to do with your own operations to help you manage that type of stuff. So when you're talking about media and open records requests, obviously you've got to be responsive to both of them. We do have an obligation to the public as civil servants to be responsive, to provide answers, to provide information. And then on top of that, at least with open records requests, you do have an obligation under the law. So one of the challenges that we've had, and actually it's led to some interesting, I'll say, discussions, not necessarily fights, but interesting discussions between Lucinda and myself, is when do they interface and how do they intersect, and really is there a nice clean delineation point between the two? I think the generic answer after 3 months of fighting about it is no, there isn't. So that's one of the things we wanted to kind of talk about, is how these two kind of interface with each other and how they intersect. So logistically, I just want to back up for a second. If you've got questions as we're going through it, of course, feel free to use the Q&A inside the Zoom window if you're watching on FeedLoop. And I am also watching FeedLoop, so if you want to use the chat feature on FeedLoop, we'll be taking a look at that as we go through this as well. So, without any further ado, let's dive in and get going at this. So, what is an open or a public record? Well, the real simple way to think about it is, if you work for the government, darn near anything you do and use has the potential to be a public record. So you're talking about documents, electronic documents, audio documents, video, paper, anything like that that contains information or preserved in any type of medium. So it can be, stuff that you stored on your server during your email, stuff inside of your email account, even records contained inside, like if you use an electronic calendar, anything contained in there can be used as well. And the other frontier you guys need to really be interested in as well is your phone records. When you're doing your job, are considered an open record, as are your text messages. So if you were to get an open records request asking for text messages, completely in the bounds of what can be allowed. So now, who fits into that? Well, basically you're looking at government and or any political governmental subdivision. So you're talking about state and county, obviously, even townships. Then you get into branches of government, looking at departments, boards, bureaus, commissions, councils, committees. Darn near anything that falls under that government umbrella is subject to an open and public record. So now, who can get access to those? This is where things kind of start to get interesting when you get into public record. Every single person has a right to examine and copy a public record. And then whatever they can do whatever with that record, whatever they seem fit. So, some people will request open records just to get stuff. Some people, it's actually kind of a quasi-profession for them. Other people are doing it to investigate in terms of maybe for a media request that we've received. They might be looking at something like that. Other times they're looking to do an investigation into maybe a legal proceeding. There's a wide variety of different reasons why people are looking for that. Who can request it? It's anybody. And one caveat that goes with this, and it's specifically cited in Iowa Code Chapter 22, is government can't contract to hide records. So a lot of times you'll see that governmental bodies will enter into contracts with a third party to do some type of function for them. Just because that third party is doing a function doesn't mean the records they're generating are considered confidential. They're still responsible. Those records are still the responsibility of that governmental agency that entered into the contract. Sometimes people try to subterfuge it. Not allowed. So it's pretty cut and dried. No matter how you contract it, those records are going to be public unless, of course, they fall under some of the confidentiality guidelines. So How does the public go about accessing these records? Well, as we said in the last slide, every person has a right to examine records, okay? So, all right, what about the identity of the requester and the reasons why they need those records? Pay attention to that next bullet. Don't ask, it does not matter. They don't have to provide you with the reason. They don't have to tell you with why they're using them or what they're going to use for. That is not a requirement. It's not a question you're even allowed to ask in terms of Iowa law. So when you do get these type of questions, you want to make sure that, okay, they're asking me this, and your curiosity, natural human nature says curiosity. I kind of want to know what they're doing, what they're interested in. Sometimes you'll see that inside the body of the request. Other times it won't say anything. It'll just say, I want this. If it doesn't say, you have no right to be out there asking why they need it. And definitely, you can definitely not refuse to provide records based upon the reason that they intend to use them. If they are considered an open record, they have to be provided. Now, that request can be made to you in any particular format. So you're talking about a simple phone call. I want to see records that do this, or maybe an email, or maybe actually a formal letter. And we'll have some examples of this as we get further down into the presentation. One of the things that the Public Information Board has been particular about, and I don't remember the agency, but they said we would only take public open records requests if they are provided in this format. And the law does not provide that. It can be in any of these formats. Like I said, it's as simple as a phone call. I want to see this, as an email, a formal letter. Any of those qualify as a formal request. So one of the things, you don't see this happening too much anymore, is you also have to allow for the physical examination of the records during office hours. So if you had, and this is kind of back in the day, and I think in the 25 plus years I've been with the department, I think we've had maybe one or two instances where we had a person come in and physically look at the records. But you have to be able to provide it. So if they said, I want to come in and see all the records you have on this, you have to set up a room for them to come in and look at them. They are not allowed to make copies at that point. If they wanted copies, they would have to ask you for those copies. So that's part of the request process. But as I said, the physical examination of the record is one of those things that really doesn't happen that much anymore, because a lot of the requests you'll see now, the preferred method of delivery is going to be via an electronic format such as PDF. And we'll kind of cover that, some of the things you want to pay attention to when you're working on PDF records. Now, that last bullet on there as well, pay attention to the all caps in there. Establish a public records policy and stick to it. Don't just make it up as you go along, and certainly don't change it as you go along, because that creates its own set of problems. So define a policy and stick with it. I know Amy Barrett up in BV, she has a really good, strong policy that she uses. I think it's about a page and a half, real simple, real clean. Says, if we have open records requests, this is how they're going to be handled. For us, our open records policy is found on our website. We tend to mirror what the governor's office does. So any costs that we might potentially be charging, those are already out front. People know what they're going to be running into. You are allowed to charge. So if you do get to a point where you're going to talk about charging, you want to talk about the cost of making the copies. So we're still talking about the physical paper. But you also want to talk about the cost of the personnel being involved in that, because it's not just making the copies. You have to go through a review process as well. We'll kind of discuss that a little bit here in a second as well. But take those last capitalized out of there. Pay attention to that. Establish a policy and stick to it. That's one of the big things you can do that will help yourself out. If you're making it up willy-nilly, specifically if you're dealing with the media, and you do it that way, they will ping you on it, and then you're already behind the 8 ball when you get going. So let's take a look at some examples. These are ones, I think for the most part, ones we've received this year. This was one we got from a law firm, and as you can see, what they were looking for is documents related to the ADM plant fire or explosion over in Clinton, Iowa. You can see they were looking for written documentation, photographs, videos, correspondence between a collection of people that would have been responding, and anything between us and all of those. So they were looking for these, and this is in response to what I would anticipate would be a legal proceeding. So pretty straightforward, well formally written, obviously meets all of the requirements. You can see down on the bottom, they prefer that the documents are sent in electronic form to that email address they were using there. So they're not looking for the actual physical documents. They would prefer to have them electronically. So that's kind of one example. Now we're going to start to see another example of one that's kind of getting into the blend of what we've got here, what we're kind of talking about. It's a media request, but it's also got a also has an open records component to it. So what you can see here is this came from Ryan Foley with the AP, and if you've been in emergency management, specifically around the pandemic, Ryan's probably reached out to you at some point in time. So he's working on a story, and I don't necessarily know what the story is. It doesn't necessarily matter on our end. I mean, we can play the guessing game, and you can kind of figure out where he's going. But what he was looking for was state purchases related to personal protective equipment, PPE, and then he had some examples of mask gowns, face shield, and other things that were used for healthcare workers. But then he's also looking for any orders that the state made to the federal stockpile from a time period from February 1 to whatever the present, when this was April 14th. So he's looking for a variety of different things, and we have a responsibility to gather those type of things up. But we would also take a look at, okay, what fits under here in terms of confidentiality? What are things that we're going to be looking at extracting? So now we have another one, and this one gets a little interesting as well. This is from Zach Smith over at the Press Citizen. So I want you to kind of take a look at the email on the left-hand side, and what you're seeing is, so he's got some generic type of questions. If we had received the email just on the left side, that in and of itself is a combination media request, open records request, because you notice in the first paragraph after the introduction to Kathy, I'm sure she has been in numerous meetings on a variety of topics. Was she present for conference calls where IDPH solicited outbreak metrics from Johnson and Lynn County Public Health Department? So that's kind of a media question. Was she there? Was she aware of what was discussed? Next paragraph, I'm also requesting to view her calendar for March 15th to March 28th. And then the request is attached, so you see the request is the attached on the right side. If we had just the email on the left, that's adequate enough to be an open records request. So specifically what he's asking for is to take a look at the director's calendar for that time period. He further specifies it in the document that you see on the right. So you can see, now you're starting to see the media and the open record side of things start to blend together, which is kind of how this whole thing ends up fitting together once you get into it. So here's another one, and our good folks at Lynn County will recognize this one. The folks at Polk County will also recognize this one as a very similar request they received back during the flash flood event. So and this is from Ethan Stein with KCRG, what he is looking for is a copy of the database the assessor has collected behind the State of Iowa Preliminary Damage Assessment link. So that damage collector that you guys publish, or the local emergency managers publish out to local folks to say, hey, if you've got damage, put it in here, we can see it. That helps gear what your response is going down at the local level. Obviously, we use it up at the state level to talk about presidential disaster declarations and things of that nature. So he is asking to see all of that information that sits behind that. Now, if most of you have gone in there and taken a look at that, you'll notice one of the things you'll probably recall is when you click on that link, it takes you to a survey form, and one of the first things you see right on the top of the link is that any information provided in here is considered confidential under Iowa Code Section 22.7, Paragraph 18. So that leads to an interesting question. We've got data that we've already told the public is private. He's asking to see it. So how do we handle those type of requests when we get into that? So now we're starting to get into a little bit, we're dipping our toes into the confidentiality part of it. There are open records, but you also have confidentiality. So, in all of these instances, you've got an open records request. My one suggestion to you that in terms of how they've handled these, use a single point of contact within your operation. We will have open records requests come at us from a variety of different ways. Lucinda will get them. During the pandemic, Kathy would get them. We might even get some filtered through to us, like from public health. They can come from a variety of different angles, but they have to meet at one singular point to make sure that the process is managed correctly. So identify a single point of contact within your operation to do that. For emergency managers, that's a really simple idea. You want to have one person doing it so you can control the inbound and outbound effort. As soon as you get that open records request, acknowledge that you've received it. Because if you don't make that acknowledgement, they're going to start pinging you and saying, did you get it, did you get it, did you get it? We had, actually this year during the pandemic, we got a second letter that was faxed to us. I mean, good Lord, who even faxes anymore? But this one company faxed us, and in the letter they said, we have not received a reply to our fax dated, and it was like 3 weeks prior to the second letter. Went back and looked, and we never got the first fax, and I told them that. I said, I don't know where you sent it. It never showed up. I checked our logs, but I acknowledged the receipt of the second letter. Always acknowledge receipt so they know that you've got it and that you are working on it. As we said before, copies can be provided if requested, but a lot of times you don't see that anymore. Now it's all electronic. Most of your requests, at least the ones we've seen, they would prefer to have the documents in an electronic format. Once again, pay attention to the all caps. I've carried this over from another slide. Establish a policy on how you're going to handle these and stick to it. Be consistent. If as soon as you start being inconsistent, that starts to raise red flags. As I said before, include the cost of making copies as well as the personnel cost to do the review. So our policy here at the department mirrors what the governor does. We will do, once we do the search and we get the records back, be it emails, documents, whatever, we'll do the first 3 hours of review of those documents at no charge. And interestingly enough, kind of the standard that I was not aware of, but upon hindsight, it's actually pretty accurate, is an individual can review about 70 emails an hour. So what you will see is a lot of those emails, when you do specifically on email searches, you'll see repetitive emails. You'll see the email kind of buried inside a string, and the string just keeps expanding. So you can knock out a lot of emails fairly quickly, but then you'll get into ones that have documents that are going to require a little bit more. So it averages out to be about 70 emails an hour. Then we also charge, so how do we figure out what we charge? We look at the base rate of the individual doing the review, and what does that hourly rate equate out to, and then that's how we arrive at it. So if we got a request for emails, and let's say it generated 7,000 emails, okay, so at 70 an hour, that's going to take me 100 hours? Is that right? My math's right? It's going to take a lot of time. So we would look at, in that case, saying, okay, this is what our rate is, this is what our policy says this is what our rate, this is how fast we can do it, this is what we think it's going to cost. And then we would forward that to them and let them know. So, but make sure you've got that policy in place that says, you know, we're going to provide, even if you are going to provide X number of hours of free review, this is what we're going to charge if we go beyond the 3 hours. So it's upfront so the person understands what they're getting to. Iowa law says that most requests should be answered within 10 days, preferably no more than 20. I'll be honest with you, we do try to meet the 10-day requirement, but there have been times when I have more than missed the 20-day requirement. And that just deals specifically, we ran into that a lot with the pandemic, because the documents that were being requested came from a variety of different angles and had a variety of different senders, and a lot of times I wasn't able to ascertain by myself if those documents would be considered confidential, so they have to go back to the originator and ask them. If they are considered confidential, then you need to figure out why they're confidential. So that can add a lot of time and pressure to the effort that you're trying to undertake. It's necessarily not easy when you've got a wide variety of particularly emails and documents sitting in there from a variety of different sources, which may have a different variety of, I'm just looking at the text. Okay. AJ's typing in some stuff. Just want to check to see what he was saying. So we want to make sure that we're being responsive, but also recognize there's nothing wrong with you telling the individual making the request to say, hey, I've got this number of documents. It's going to take me some time to get through these. I want to try to be as open and transparent with the processing these as you can.
So, John, are you saying that you need to acknowledge the request within 10 days or 20 days, or actually fulfill the request?
Fulfill the request.
Okay.
Iowa law asks you to fulfill the request within 10 days. So, now, we've all talked, we spent a lot of time here talking about what is open, and we're open. And everybody in their brain right now is looking at this and going, okay, Benson, there's got to be some stuff that we can withhold. And you're absolutely correct, and Iowa law does provide those provisions. So, the one on this slide here, these are typically the paragraphs under Code of Iowa, Chapter 22.7, that we will use to do exclusions. Now, if you were to talk about looking at, like with DHS or Department or Public Health, they would use some of these, but they're also going to fall under some federal guidelines like HIPAA and things like that. But for the emergency management realm, this is kind of where we live. So as we talked about the paragraph 18, the first one up there, when we use it, when the public-facing damage collector is out there, that's what it's referencing is the 22.7 paragraph 18. Communications gathered from a person outside of government that the person would not otherwise likely disclose unless they had the assurance of confidentiality. So they're offering up some kind of personal information with regard to damage that they had to their home, the location of their home, all of those type of things that in this day and age, if that were to get out publicly, you would probably have some vultures coming in trying to do some unsavory practices, You see that quite often after a disaster. Well, let's not make it easy for those folks. So if you give us the data, we're going to keep that confidential. The next one, paragraph 45, deals with the critical asset protection plan. So as most of you know, the state does maintain a critical asset protection plan. Inside of that, it does list critical assets. And so we're allowed to keep that confidential under paragraph 45. Similarly, under paragraph 50, this got changed just recently as well. Information and records concerning physical infrastructure, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, security procedures, or emergency preparedness developed, maintained, or held by a government body for protection of life and property, if disclosure could be reasonably expected to jeopardize such life and property. We use this, presently we view this one as being able to lock down the state response plan, county response plans, things of that nature. It used to be in the past, this paragraph had a component to it that said that in this case, like the commission would have to adopt a policy that says this document is considered confidential. That language was struck out of that paragraph, so it just is confidential. This has led to some, I'm going to use the word disagreement. The media is not necessarily a fan of this paragraph because they would like to come in and look at preparedness documents and things of that nature. I don't necessarily have an opinion on who's right or who's wrong. It is what it is, and that's the way we're interpreting it right now. We have not been taken to in front of the Public Information Board with regard to that, nor to court. So that's how we're treating it as well. The last, or 67, deals specifically with information contained inside of Alert Iowa or even other alerting systems, since we know everybody's not on Alert Iowa in the state. So personal information, similar like we have in paragraph 18, that a person volunteers to put in the system for the purposes of them being alerted for something bad that's happening. Any information in there is going to be considered confidential. So that kind of mirrors the confidentialities that you see inside of the 911 system as well. You can't take information out of Alert Iowa and make a mailing list. You're just not allowed to do things like that. So that's kind of an interesting one that came along when Alert Iowa, and that was brought in, but we did make it available to other alerting systems as well. And the final one is actually a mirror kind of a semi-mirror of 50, and it applies specifically to the department and as well as the IUB with regard to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure information that are held by the department. So 50 and 71 are kind of mirrors, but 71 is a specific that deals with the IUB and our department. So you do have capability to get documents to be considered confidential. It's not the wild, wild west where you have to kick everything out the door. So one of the things that I constantly see, and it comes in from sources outside, are the dreaded email footers. The first one you see up there, email is intended for the addressee shown. It contains information that is confidential and protected from disclosure. Any review, blah, 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 blah. If you think this is a good footer, please raise your hand. Can't see ya. If you think it's a bad footer, please raise your hand. Can't see ya. The answer to the question is this doesn't help anybody or anything. If you are going to say something is considered confidential, you have to provide a legal cite in terms of why it's confidential. I see this generic one slapped on the bottom of emails all the time. It means absolutely nothing and has no legal authority or capability behind it. Now, the next one I've seen pop up quite a bit lately as well, and it's talking about the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which you can find under Chapter 18 of the United States Code. So that looks really impressive because it has a code cite to it. So, okay, you're going, all right, we're about there. I think we're good. And it says it may contain information that is privileged, confidential, or exempt from disclosure under applicable law. However, in this case, the ECPA only applies to emails that arrive in somebody's inbox in error. So if you got an email from somebody that you don't know, shouldn't have received it, this would actually apply. However, if you are the intended recipient, it says, okay, you got the email, now you don't have to destroy it, you can read it, but it doesn't mean it's confidential. So this doesn't really help either. So you'll see these kind of generic ones. If you're doing an open records review and you see these on the bottom of an email, they don't count. I mean, that's the easiest way I can say it. They just don't count. So let's talk about how we do redactions really quick. Quick is not the right way to say it. Let's talk about how we do redactions correctly. So, as I said, the generic footers and that type of stuff, don't use them. They don't work. If you're going to put a legal redaction document or redaction statement on the bottom of your email, have an attorney draft it up for you and make sure you have the legal ability to redact that document. Just because you say it should be confidential doesn't necessarily mean that it is. You have to cite specific federal law or state law that's causing the redaction to happen. Have that reviewed by an attorney. So as you're working through documents, you're going to find elements of documents or entire documents or even emails that are going to be considered confidential. Make sure if you're going to redact them and not release them, you have to be able to cite a specific federal law or state law in terms of why it's being redacted. My recommendation, too, if you have access to an attorney, specifically if you are going to redact, make sure they have take a look at it. If you're going to release something that you have questions about that you think maybe could be redacted but you're not sure, have an attorney look at it. All right, notice the bold on the next bullet. Learn how to redact the document properly and use that in a PDF. Now, I always recommend using, and most legal folks will say, use a PDF to redact the document because it's not an editable document. Now, the caveat that goes with that is you have to use a copy of, is it Adobe Acrobat? Is that the fully loaded one? So the fully loaded version of Adobe will have a redaction tool inside of it. So what you will see, if you don't use the redaction tool, what you're going to do, people will draw a black box over the information they want redacted, and they'll ship it off. Well, the person who gets it opens up in their PDF viewer and just strips the black box off of there, and they can look at whatever you sent. If you use the redaction tool inside of Adobe, what it does, it'll ask you what you want redacted. You'll highlight it, and then it will say, do you want to remove all of the metadata that goes with it and everything? And essentially what it does is it strips, not only does it strip the visual portion of the language out of the document, it strips out all of the underlying language that hides behind the document that generated it. So all of it gets torn out of it, it's gone. The person that received it has no way of looking at that document. So if you've redacted it correctly as a PDF, they're not going to be able to see it. I can't strongly stress that enough. If you're going to start using PDF to do redaction, learn how to do it correctly. It becomes very important. If you do it wrong, it will come back to bite you. So let's talk about a couple of examples. And these are ones that I have used, actually I've used this year. So we got a request for to look at WebEOC. So as most of you know, if you are a WebEOC user, you have to sign a user agreement to get in there and use it. So we had this request. This was my reply to them. Data contained within the system we used to manage the request for assistance is considered confidential under Iowa Code Sections 22.7, Paragraph 50, and Paragraph 71. As such, we do not release the detailed information contained within that system. Very simple, very straightforward. Explains why we're not releasing it. Here's your code cites, so we're not releasing it. Now, sometimes you will get into a situation where you're talking about specific emails. You're not going to redact the entire email, but there are elements inside of the email that you're going to redact. So here was a reply to one of them. So we've got an email on 3/16 from Sam Langholtz. It's a draft of the proclamation. It is removed in accordance with paragraph 65, which allows draft documents to not be released until they get into their final format. Also, another one on the 16th where it's removed in accordance, meeting notes were removed in accordance with 22.750 because those were considered part of the ongoing state response effort. The 3/16, the email from Joyce, it had a list of passengers on it that were redacted in accordance with HIPAA and possibly could have also been redacted under 18 and 50. And then Scott Marler, specific language redacted. So you can see in each of the emails that we're releasing, we're redacting part of what was inside of the email, and here's the legal reason why we're doing it. Now I'm going to show you another one. Remember back to the request we got from Ethan Stein. He wanted to see the information from the individual houses that were collected inside of the damage collector. Very specific information tied to people. Here's the response we provided. Take a moment and read this to yourself. Don't read it. Actually, what it does is, what it's saying is, it's a far more, and obviously you can tell I did not write this, but what it is, it's a far more legal-centric form of redaction, specifically getting into citing case law. The request that we got from Ethan Stein was similar to a request that we got from the Register, and the Register is very astute about how they handle their open records requests, and if they feel they have a foot in the door to kind of ping you on it or fight you on it, they will fight you on it. This one is written in such a way that we're heading off the fight before we even get there. So this entire reply is based on, okay, the first two paragraphs say, no, we can't give it to you. And here's the legal reasons why we can't. Now, the back portion of it says, you know, we may be able to give you some information out of here that's generic and aggregated. Would you be interested in that? Bottom line is this, is it shut down the request as soon as they got the reply back. We did not hear back from them. Same response with Ethan Stein over at KCRG. So you can go from very simple to very legally complicated. So, as we talked about, here's our open records policy. Feel free to pilfer it if you would like. We have no ownership of it. It very much mirrors what the governor's office does. So you can see we talk about copying costs, 10 copies up front, free, no charge. Additionals, we charge at a rate. 3 hours administrative work, no charge. After that, it's a pro rata salary of the person. Then we talk about the thing that's going to, the administrative work includes locating, screening, review, copy, electronic preparation, blah, 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 the cost estimates and payments. If you are interested in this, once we post this to the website, please feel free to use this to establish your own policy. You're more than welcome to use it. So, our open records requests from October of 2019 through September of 2020, we've had about 23 open records requests. Some of them relatively simple, some of them extremely complicated that have required quite a bit of effort. Obviously, most of those during this time period came from the media. We did have a couple of lawsuit-related ones. And I will say one of the more interesting ones we had a couple of years ago It was a lawsuit out of Cedar Rapids where the individual was asserting that parking the hopper cars on top of the bridge during the flood of 2008 caused the entire flood of 2008 in Cedar Rapids. So he wanted a copy of every single public assistance document we had. Yeah, that would have taken a long time. Thankfully, the suit was thrown out of court before we had a chance to respond to it. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're at. Now, let's talk about media, and this is where Lucinda's going to take over.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm going to talk a bit about the types of media requests we get, how we handle them, and then how they intersect with open records requests. Just to give you an idea, in the past state fiscal year that ended in June of this year, we had 63 total requests. Just since July 1st of this year, we've received 51 requests, and most of those have been about the derecho. And you probably can't tell because we're wearing masks, but these are actual photos of John and I. And he's the one in the bow tie.
Looking sharp as always.
As always.
All right. Get back on it. All right. All right, good.
Okay, so we get the majority of our media requests from Iowa media. Some of our typical customers are the Associated Press, the Des Moines Register, Iowa Public Radio. KCRG has been one of our frequent customers since August 10th. We do get some national media requests from network and cable news. Most of those come to us immediately after a disaster, after an incident starts. They don't have people on the ground, and their local affiliates may not be out yet. We also hear from national radio outlets like NPR and some of the big newspapers like the New York Times and Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Occasionally, we'll get requests from other countries. I remember specifically in 2008 when the Little Sioux Scout Ranch was hit and some scouts were killed. We did have some calls from overseas. It was a big story.
Yeah. Yeah, and your overseas calls will show up at like 3 in the morning because that's when they're working. So your Japan calls at like 3 or 4 in the morning. That's all I
So fortunately, John was taking the overnight calls at that time. They come from the traditional print TV and radio, but also, as you know, there are a lot of internet sites that are special interest. So we hear from reporters who want to talk about the environment. The Dakota Access Pipeline was a big request that we got. It was a media request and a big open records request that I think took about a year or so to actually, I don't know if we ever actually finished it.
We finished our portion of it.
Yeah, it was kind of a nightmare. There's an anti-gun violence site who wanted to talk to us about ALICE training in the state of Iowa. And I neglected to put this on the slide, but also political websites. We just finished, hopefully, knock on wood, request from Bleeding Heartland.
Yep, that's all part and parcel of the changing media environment is you have your traditional news outlets, and then you've got your non-traditionals, which are, like as Lucinda was saying, the Bleeding Heartland. They have a very specific slant in terms of what they're trying to write, but it's another media outlet that you just have to be aware of and how to understand how to work with.
So emergency management is a big field. We do lots of different things, so we get media questions on lots of different things. During disaster response, reporters want to know, stats especially, they want to know if there have been fatalities, injuries, are there evacuations taking place, how many people have been evacuated, who's being sheltered. They want to know what the state is doing. And we want to engage them at that time, too, because we want to help us get information to the public on the things they should be doing. We get questions on disaster recovery, and most of the time it's project-specific, like buyouts. We're still getting questions on buyouts from the 2019 Missouri River flooding. We get questions on specific programs, 911, our training program, activation of special teams. Once in a while, we get some weird requests. If you recall, a few years ago, space junk was a big topic. And the local ABC affiliate called and wanted to know what the state's space junk response plan was. And I was a little thrown, but I quickly went back to our all hazards planning and response message. Sometimes we have reporters that are localizing a national story. An example would be the collapse of the I-35 bridge in Minneapolis. And so reporters wanted to know what the state of Iowa would do to respond to that kind of tragedy. So much like John said, we have one point of entry for our media requests. And those come in through our PIO staff, so that's Molly Halverson and I. John also assists us. He puts on a PIO hat every now and then. And just as an aside, we actually do have PIO hats. We forgot to wear them today, but they're sequin fedoras and they light up. So once those requests come in, we have to figure out how we're going to fill them. If we're lucky, we can just send them on to another agency. Sometimes just the PIOs are able to provide that information, either something, it might be something simple, like what were the awards for the Flood Recovery Fund through the Iowa Flood Mitigation Board. It might be something a little bit more complex that we have to reach out to other people in our agency to answer. There are times when they're a little bit bigger requests and we have to coordinate interviews for Joyce or John or some of the management team or our subject matter experts to help us fulfill those requests. And of course, we're going to watch for the stories. We're going to make sure that they're accurate, and then we're going to do follow-up if we need to. And one important thing I forgot to mention is we keep our department leadership and sometimes the governor's office in the loop on these requests, because we don't want them to be blindsided when the story shows up or if they're out in public and a reporter will ask them a question. So we have a philosophy, we have a way that we do things, and it's built on several things. Of course, we want to respond in a timely manner, and we do our best to meet their deadlines. In fact, that's one of the first questions we ask them is, what is your deadline? We want to put our responses in writing if possible. We have found that if we have it in writing, of course, we have a record of what we're telling them, and we can check that against what the article or story actually says. Plus, doing that gives us a little bit more time to craft our response and our message to them. We are, to the best of our ability, courteous and professional, because we don't want to become the story. I don't want any reporters to say Lucinda Parker was rude to me and slammed the phone down. Usually I will wait until after I slam the phone down and then say rude things about them, but I don't say it to them.
Yeah, she's not lying on that.
Yeah, it's true. We want to be friendly and helpful, but we can't forget that they have a job to do, and that's to get a story. But our job is to make sure that we represent our agency fairly and accurately. We're going to be responsive but careful with what we share with reporters. John can attest to this. Sometimes I agonize over every word of our responses. I think of it as walking a tightrope sometimes.
Yeah, she's very correct on that when she says that she agonizes over language. When you're talking about a written reply to someone, you have to remember that for the most part, if you do a written reply, the individual reporter is going to take that lock, stock, and barrel right out of what you wrote, and they're going to put it in the paper or use it in their story. So the art of using the correct word becomes very important, and Lucinda and she'll come and try hunt for words, and there's been times where to create a single sentence, we'll sit and banter back and forth for 15, 20 minutes, just trying to get the language to a certain way to make it say a certain thing. It becomes very important. So it's utilizing your communication skills to the best ability that you have. It becomes very important in this situation. Right,
and only answering the question. I think I'm a very chatty person, and I'm the kind of person who will tell you how to make a watch if you ask me what time it is. But we don't want to open up a can of worms, I guess. We're always going to be truthful, and we're always going to give them what we ask, because as a public body, that is our job to do so. but we also want to be careful how we do it. As we all know, nothing is ever off the record, and also be careful about hot mics. John and I were just discussing the University of Nebraska president a couple of weeks ago who didn't realize a mic was on, and he talked about the football season starting, and that got reporters really stirred up. We serve our usual customers first, especially in the first hours of a disaster, when we get a lot of national media calling us. I'm going to make sure that we respond to our Iowa media first, because those are the people that we've worked to build relationships with. And I think another good part of being a good PIO and doing our job is making sure we know what's in the news so we can see what might be coming at us and can prepare for that. Open records and media requests, they do intersect. I mean, you've already seen that through John and I, what we've been talking about. So most of the time, the media requests, they come to me and we will fulfill them if at all possible. Now, if we can't release that information, reporters then may file an open records request, and that's when I would give that to John. Sometimes, though, reporters will start right away with an open records request, and it may be because they know that information is confidential and they're not going to get it, but they still file it so they can write a story and say, HSEMD would not give me this information. Sometimes they just want to cast a wide net to see what they can catch. And I think we've seen that since the pandemic quite a lot, is reporters will file a big open records request for emails, and they will get several stories. They may request it for a specific purpose, but they are getting information that lead them on to other stories. And there are some reporters that just play hardball. That's all they do is file open records requests. And I won't name any names, but some of them have that in their bios because government is bad and they're not going to give me information unless I force them to.
And I think I want to back up to that, cast a wide net to see what they can catch. Reporters with open records are starting to get very astute at what I would call answer shopping. So we had this happen, and I don't think Steve O'Connick's on the phone with us today, but during the derecho, Steve was fielding quite a few numbers of open records requests over there, and he got asked a couple of things related to WebEOC and then also with regard to the damage collector, which we saw here. So Steve, in doing the right thing, he turned around and called me and said, hey, I got this request for this information. I don't think it's releasable. Is that what do you agree with me on that? My answer was yes. He said, so I'm going to say it's not releasable because it's not our system. And he says, I'm going to walk away from it. I said, that's perfectly fine. We'll end up seeing the request over here, and then we'll provide the legal site. Be cognizant of that if you're dealing with an open records request that's going to possibly reach out and touch a wide variety of different people. They may be asking the same thing to somebody else. And what they're doing is they're just hoping to find somebody that's going to potentially interpret the confidentiality laws incorrect, and then they get the documents that should be considered confidential.
Yeah, so John and I disagree a little bit about media requests and when they become open records requests. To me, it's not an open records request until the reporter tells me that it is. And John, on the other hand.
On the other hand, if the reporter is asking for anything related to a document, I consider it an open records request. So Lucinda and I have sat and fought around, not fought is not the right word.
Oh, yeah, we fought.
We fought. But we've discussed this a ton, and I think we quickly recognize that there is not a right answer, there is not a wrong answer. It just is what it is. They blend. There's a point in time when they get blended so tightly together that you really can't tell the difference. So being the senior leadership, I'm obviously right. Lucinda's just going to have to learn to adapt to that.
Okay.
Yeah, whatever.
All right, so as you've seen, there are some challenges. Sometimes it's difficult to determine if there are legal restrictions on release of information. Sometimes it's very clear, and John has given you some examples that we know are restrictions for us, but sometimes we need legal guidance, and we'll go to the Attorney General's office for assistance with that. Another challenge is, we have to work internally to get things approved before we do a release, and that takes some coordination and some detective work. As John mentioned a little bit earlier, there are other agencies that are involved. So not only we want to make them aware that we may be releasing information that could impact their agency, but we need to figure out who does this information belong to, who is authorized to release it. So that can take some time.
Yeah, this year was specifically with the pandemic. We've had a single request come into us that it touches our office, it touches the governor's office, it touches public health, it touches human services, and it touches DAS purchasing, all from a single request. So that all has to be coordinated in how we figure out how to respond to that.
And, of course, with these big requests, whether they're media requests or open records requests, it takes time sometimes, and we might not be able to meet their deadlines, but we want to be open with them and tell them why when we possibly can. And there's that staff time it takes to process requests. Mostly everything is electronic now, and we can work with our IT staff to filter those emails before we process them. But there was a time when most of our records were on paper, so we had to devote staff time to going through those records, copying them, processing them to make those available electronically. So that can tie people up for weeks, and that's something to be cognizant of. And that is something, as John pointed out a little bit earlier, you can include in your charges.
Absolutely, when you're dealing with open records. You are entitled to charge.
We have a few resources we can suggest for you. The Attorney General's office has what's called sunshine advisories on their sites. That goes into some detail on open records requests. I know John would be happy to work with you, and he has worked with some of you. And then for media requests, please feel free to reach out for me if you want to just talk through something or do some brainstorming. I'd be happy to help if I can.
So that gets us to the end of the presentation. So hang on, I got to find. So we did have some question and answers I saw that came in. So let's see. So A.J. Seeley had some questions with regard to lawful custodian. Our county attorney believes that if a county EMA receives a document from another entity, we, the county, become then the lawful custodian of the document. This is especially concerned going potential different interpretations of the code, trying to stick to response requirements of what HSEMD determined the best approach to determine what is public and what is not. A.J., my suggestion on when you get into something like that is this, is I'm not going to debate who's the lawful custodian of the document, but I would work back with the originator of the document to find out if they view it as confidential. If they did, first off, they should have labeled it confidential when it came to you, and there's instances where that does not happen, but you might want to check to make sure. It gets back to the old emergency management thing, coordinate, coordinate, coordinate. Same type of thing. You want to make sure that you're talking to everybody, because if you didn't originate the document, at least work back to the person that did originate or the agency that did originate it. So that's kind of a suggestion there. Let's see. AJ's winning in terms of number of questions so far. He had a mediocre lunch, so that's good news. We had issues this come up over the COVID outbreak at Tybin, over 1,200 emails to review. Many PHI, many operations plans related, about 50% required redaction to some degree. So that's kind of a good stat there, because you're talking about a fairly large number of emails, 1,200, and you're talking about a 50% required redaction. So obviously, AJ, you're working through the process. You're trying to understand what's going on in there. Always seek. But he leads into his next question is, what is HSEMD's policy on requests for fees to be waived in public interest? You will see that phrase, the fees to be waived in public interest, with accompanying most requests that you get from a member of the media. If it's over $50, they will tend to panic and say, well, this is for the public interest. The strategy I will use is this, is when I get the initial request, let's say we're doing an email search and it comes back with, 1,500, 2,000 emails, something like that. So what we will do is, if I know it's gonna take me an excessive amount of time and the policy says we need to charge them, I'm going to reach back to them and say, listen, here's what the email search turned up. It turned up X number. It's going to take me this amount of time, and per our policy, it's going to cost you this. Is there a way we can pare that request down to get it into more manageable for me to take care of, but also for you so you're not having to sift through a bunch of stuff? A lot of times for the individual that's made that request, they appreciate that reach back and will actually work to pare down the request. We had that happen this year with a group out of D.C. called Accountable U.S. Their initial request to us came back with 25,000 emails. So I called her, I said, hey, listen, here's what it came back with. I mean, I'm willing to do it. I got to charge you for it. She said, no. She goes, let me pare this down a little bit. And she pared down her search terms. Then we got into, that came back with a more manageable request that I could process in a relatively short amount of time. So you always want to kind of be working, create a relationship with there, but sometimes, you know what, they're hardcore, they want my request, I want it filled, I'm not changing anything, well, okay, here's what it is. If they requested the fees to be waived, you don't have to waive it.
Yeah, but just out of curiosity, John and I looked up the most expensive open records request. Wasn't there one for information concerning El Chapo that was $22 million?
Oh, yeah, she found that one. It was the largest fee charge on an open records. It was an enormous amount of cash. Obviously, the people didn't pay for it. So, all right, so the next two are actually kind of Lucinda ones. Comes from Melissa Spencer. Does HSEMD consider online bloggers the same as mainstream media outlets when providing access to an agency press conferences?
Yes, we do. We don't require them to have any kind of credentials for press conferences. I know the governor's office does have that policy, and I can't tell you exactly what it is. But we do want to keep track of them, and we have them sign in, of course, so we can monitor what their stories are, and we know what news outlets they're coming from.
Yep, so, and then Kip our good friend Kip up in Bremer kind of asked the same sort of question. Can just about anyone who carries a camera or notepad call themselves media? Treat all the same, assume they are?
Yeah, we pretty much will. Now, if it's a Iowa State student in journalism class who's writing a story and wants us to just really write it for them because they don't know how to be a reporter yet, we're probably going to treat them a little bit differently. But you're right, everybody is a reporter. Everybody has a cell phone. Social media and the internet is a medium that everyone can access and put information on. So our job is to tell the story of our department and to provide information that the public wants to know. So the answer is yes.
Yep. So those are all really good questions, and I think it gets back to that discussion of, as Kip and Melissa were kind of hinting at, you've got so many different types of media out there these days. It used to be it was print, radio, TV. That was it. And then you have the birth of the blogger and all of these other different things that are happening. And, I will say, this kind of was Melissa's question, the question of the blogger. Honestly, some of the best reporting, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with what the reporter has written, but some of the best things I've seen reported are actually being done by bloggers. They figured out a way to, make money doing that, and some of them write some really good quality stories in terms of, how it's researched, how it's put together. Don't get me wrong. There's some bloggers out there I wholeheartedly disagree with what they're writing, but they're damn good writers. So, like Kip and Melissa are asking, there's a whole bunch of different types of media out there, and I think you got to be able to address all of them.
And you have to keep in mind, too, that not everybody is getting their information from traditional news media. I think especially young people, I sound very old when I say that, but they get their news from social media. I just talked to my stepkids over the weekend who are 21 and 24. So where do you get your news? They get it all through social media. So we have to make sure that we're utilizing every mechanism we can.
Yep. All right, so Shane just shot in a question. This is a good one, too. Do you make them pay fees before sending information? The answer to that question would be yes. The documents are not going out until we would receive pay. Now, as long as I have been here, to be honest with you, we have never charged. So we've never been in a situation where we've had such a huge volume on a specific request that I've actually charged somebody. We have, like I was talking about from AJ's question, if we've gotten into a situation where it's going to be a large volume, I'm going to reach back to them and say, hey, listen, this is what it cranked out. Because honestly, if it's a 25,000 emails and I cut them all loose, they're not going to be able to get through them either. So it's not to their benefit. I mean, that's a ton of stuff to get through. So it's always working back with them and say, hey, maybe there's a better way I can get you what you need, and kind of working with them. And then they feel like they're participating in the process. But the answer to the question is, yeah, you don't get the product unless you were to shoot me the payment. I mean, that's pretty simple business. And I know we're government, we don't do business, but that's how we do it. So, all right, and Kip had provided the comment, and sometimes the local, and he's quoting this, local with a phone and a notepad feed news to the traditional media. Absolutely,
Yeah.
they do. You'll
Yeah.
notice that they mine, as Lucinda was talking about, social media will feed tips to the traditional media. And a lot of times you will see them hop on and run with a tip they got off of social media. Even if it's not a good tip or a bad tip, they will go with it. So, we got 3 minutes
All right,
left?
we've been.
Holy cow! Beth just came in and gave us the stink eye, so she's telling us we have to
That's
stop.
harsh.
So, before we actually get cut off of here, first off, I want to thank, because I think we had about 45 people. Yep, we had about 45 people in on this session. So thanks for coming in. For everybody that was here and attended a variety of the sessions over the course of the 3 days, thank you for doing it. The numbers, as I was watching it, the numbers were really good in each of the sessions, really high attendance rates. I hope everybody appreciates the effort that was put in to make this virtual. I know our staff doing a lot of work behind the scenes, obviously, like John Paoli, Jensen Connor, Allie Bright, Beth, Steve, all of those folks back there got us into a virtual environment, so it was really good. Yeah, Kip, this will be available. We'll put a video on the website. All the sessions will be, so you can hop back and go back and research anything you want. But I want to say thank you to everybody for getting here, and personally, to all of the emergency management folks and folks that operate in that arena. Quite bluntly, it's been a hell of a year so far. I'm not sure what the rest of this year has got, and I'm not sure what 2021 is going to give us. But thank you for everybody's efforts, continued work on it. The level of professionalism that I have seen under these extremely trying times has been absolutely staggering. I couldn't be prouder of the profession than I have been in these last couple of months. Extremely stressful times, but everybody got themselves put together and started working issues and continue to work issues. So, having said that, I know on behalf of the directors, thanks to everybody for coming out.